Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracy Lamb. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications at Partners in Diversity. Thank you so much for being here and taking part in the first Breakfast for Champions of 2022. I hope you and your family are doing well. As you are getting settled, a few housekeeping items. When you close out of this webinar, you will be taken to a survey about this event. Please take 2 minutes to send us your feedback, as it is very valuable to us. This session is being recorded and will be sent to you after the event. The speaker's PowerPoint will also be available. We have live captioning this morning. To activate that feature, go to the menu on the bottom of the screen and select the closed captioning icon. Please use the Q&A box for questions to our speakers. We have an exciting February full of programming for you. On February 3rd, that's next Thursday, we will share with you a blueprint for racial equity in the workplace and beyond. The session is presented by experts at PolicyLink and sponsored by Ferguson Wellman Capital. This is a chance for you to hear about different approaches because, as we know, DEI work isn't a one-size-fits-all. If you have already registered, please encourage your coworkers to join. On February 16th, in honor of Black History Month, we're hosting an equity conversations on Black achievement and anti-Blackness, an intersectional understanding of Oregon Black history. This interactive session is sponsored by Agate Executive Communications. Then on February 24th, Say Hey is back. Due to the continued health concerns over COVID, this will once again be virtual. It's sponsored by the Oregon Food Bank. Links to all of these events will be posted to the chat box. Please be sure to share them with your colleagues. Today's session kicks off a year-long series of Breakfast for Champions focusing on various stages of the DEI journey that includes setting values and systems, designing and implementing, and evaluating and reporting. These stages aren't exclusive to one another, rather they are part of an intersectional process that will look different for every organization. And it's an ongoing process. Today's session helps set that framework. We will learn and explore ways to build racial equity for long-term sustainable change. It's also important to note that sustainable change must begin at the top. That is why we offer a year-long leadership program for CEOs and executive leaders. Each cohort will meet 4 times a year with a professional DEI trainer to learn, discuss, and share topics relevant to their roles as top leaders in an organization. Registration is now open for fall courses. Fees do apply. Deadline to register is February 25th. The registration link has just been dropped in the chat box. Please share this information with your CEO and executive leaders. And of course, sustainable change also includes empowering employees of color to make sure they feel comfortable and safe. Last year, Partners in Diversity launched a community resource groups. Much like employee resource groups, our CRGs are safe affinity spaces. Right now, we have the Black Community Resource Group and the Asian Pacific Islanders Community Resource Group. Coming in March, we will have the Latino Community Resource Group. If you identify with one or more of these groups and interested in participating, please sign up. The link to the online form is being posted right now. And of course, we couldn't bring these programs to you without your support and membership. Programs like today's Breakfast for Champions is made possible by sponsors who are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our sponsor today is Greenbrier Companies. Joining us now from Greenbrier is Donna Tyner. Donna?
Good morning, and thank you, Tracy and Partners in Diversity, for holding this session and for all of your work in the community to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Greenbrier Companies is a proud sponsor of today's session on sustainability of DEI. Before I introduce our speaker, Julie Nelson, let me tell you a little about Greenbrier and our DEI journey. Greenbrier manufactures, repairs, and leases rail cars, plus builds ocean-going barges. We have locations all over the United States and plants in Mexico, Romania, Poland, Turkey, and Brazil. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a new initiative at Greenbrier. DEI lies at the heart of our core value of respect for others. In fact, it's part of the natural evolution and progression of our company, part of our ongoing learning and duty as a global leader in the freight rail sector. As many other visionary organizations do, we're evolving and improving as the world changes around us. We reflect respect for others in our IDEAL commitment. IDEAL stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and leadership. We decided to operationalize IDEAL about 16 months ago by using the Center for Global Inclusion's Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion model. We also find the Partners in Diversity sessions valuable in keeping us informed on best practices and the place where we can learn important lessons from other entities as they go on the same journey. On behalf of Greenbrier Companies and Partners in Diversity, I'm pleased to introduce to you our speaker today. Julie Nelson is the Senior Vice President of Programs at Race Forward. She was the founding director of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, a joint project of Race Forward and the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, where she serves as a senior fellow. Julie is the former director of the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, where she provided both vision and hands-on support to Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative. It was the first initiative in local government designed to dismantle institutional and structural racism and advance racial justice. Please join me in welcoming Julie Nelson.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Tracy. It is so nice to be here. And I am pulling up my PowerPoint, so give me just 1 second. And visual check, can y'all see my PowerPoint?
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Donna. Thank you to all of you who are here today. It's really a privilege. The work that you all are doing on a day in, day out basis to operationalize racial equity is critical. Want to add just a couple of things to give you a little bit of background about myself. It's always easy to say, like, here's my job, here's my role. A couple things that I want to share before I jump into the content for today, and that is that I am someone who spent the bulk of my career working in local government. I worked for the city of Seattle for 23 years. And when I went into local government, I was not anticipating that that was where I was going to spend the bulk of my career. But what I found, despite the ideas that I had about government, what I found was that local government was a place that had levers to create change, that we could change the policies, the practices, the culture of government. And that was critical because of the fact that there were racial inequities across every single indicator for success. So despite the fact that when I went into government, I had a little bit of cynicism about government, it really was where I got excited about creating change. The second thing to share about myself is that I'm a white woman who's been doing racial equity work now for about 35 years. I started when I was young, and I started because I became active in the anti-violence against women movement. I had experienced sexual assault myself, and I had wanted to give back to try and prevent violence against women. What happened was that I went to volunteer for an organization, and in that volunteer process, of the 80 hours of training that you had to undergo to become a volunteer on the crisis line, 2 days were focused on racial equity. Now, what I found was that the demographic of other people who had come to volunteer for the organization were very similar to me. We were a whole bunch of young white women that were really passionate and committed to preventing violence against women. When it came to talking about race, however, we were really ill-equipped. There's a lot of emotion in the room, but there was not a lot of skill. And so for me at that moment, I thought there's no way that we're going to be able to make progress on preventing violence against women if we can't talk about race. And so it was a pivot point. Like I said, it was a place in my life where I made the commitment across all aspects. So professionally, personally, as a parent, across my life, really focusing on racial equity. So those two things, the fact that I spent the bulk of my career in local government, now at Race Forward, but have also across different sectors have always focused on racial equity. So today, I'm really happy to be talking with you about sustainability in the work that we're doing on racial equity. So there's 3 goals that we want to focus on. The first one is developing a racial equity analysis and using some key terminology. That sometimes conversations about race can be a little bit loaded or uncomfortable. And the thing that I find is that if you don't have a shared analysis, it makes it even more uncomfortable. Second thing is that we want to increase skills at analyzing policies and practices. That it's not just a matter of having a shared analysis, but we need to take ideas and put them into action. And we need to have skills to be able to do that. And then the last thing is that we need to talk about strategies for resiliency, for organizational resiliency, for making a commitment, a long-term commitment to racial equity. I know this is a big charge for a little over an hour, but that's what we're aiming to do today. I want to start with the idea of vision. In the United States, too frequently when it comes to race, we think about the inadequacies that we have from a perspective of values, that people just have the wrong values. What the research shows is that people consistently across many different demographics name that they have a value for racial justice, they have a value for equality, they have a value for equity. And so what we have found is that it's not a question about values or even a question about vision. That it is important for us to have values and vision, and we need to take that vision and values, again, put it into action. So at Race Forward, our vision is that we imagine a just, multiracial, democratic society free from oppression and exploitation in which people of color thrive with power and purpose. Not just the negative, getting rid of oppression and exploitation, but really thinking about what we would be as a multiracial democratic society where people of color thrive with power and purpose. So that's our vision. I want to ask you all, and I would love, it's always hard in a Zoom, but going to do the best we can, would love to hear from some of you in the chat what your vision for racial equity is. And Tracy, maybe as people, I can't, in presenting, I actually can't see the chat. So if you could help me if people are putting what your vision for racial answering this question, if you could read a few of them, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely. I think people are still thinking about it. So please feel free to put your thoughts in the chat box. I think we have some shy folks here this morning. Thank you, Hazel. Hazel's saying, live fulfilling lives free of racism, equal access to opportunity for all people, eliminating bias and systemic racism oppression, equitable wealth distribution, that all people have the equal opportunities for housing, education, health, and can play and work in safe places. Creating an environment where everyone feels heard and safe. Honesty and awareness, recognizing our shared humanity. Access to resources for everyone, not just those in power and influence. No more stereotyping, realizing value and strengths we all have to contribute to society and showing respect for others. A thriving, diverse, and welcoming community in which all people can work and live. That's the Partners in Diversity vision, by the way. Respecting human rights, dismantling oppressive systems that reduce equitable access to opportunities and resources. These are all really great. Everyone realizing their full potential, opportunity regardless of race or personal background.
Tracy, thank you so much. Once people got their juices flowing, this is wonderful to see. And I would ask that you all take a deep breath and lean in those visions. The vision of what we're trying to get to, it's a beautiful possible world out there. So take a deep breath, think about those words. And now I want to ask you a different question. And that question is around, what is your organization's vision for racial equity? So we've all got sort of personal ideas around what racial equity will look and feel like, but does your organization have a vision for racial equity? Any thoughts on that one? And I did manage, Tracy, to pull the chat box up myself, so I got it now. Thank you. Give you a minute to think, but please do put your thoughts into the chat box. I love Monica's observation that, well, they have a vision, but don't know if it's a shared vision or how committed they are to it. It's a great point that sometimes, like, we put words on paper, but if those words on paper aren't actually, we're not leaning into them, that we're not making them real, we're not going to have the impact that we want. Ooh, I see a pretty lengthy one from Oregon. Is that the state of Oregon? And then it's honoring all community members and creating equitable access to city programming. Oh yes, so it is OHA. Thank you so much. Some folks saying that it's not so clear what the organizational vision is. You folks talking about equitable access to resources without bias or prejudice. I love the word access, and both the words access and opportunity in vision statements are kind of interesting to me. That thinking about what it means to create an opportunity versus the actual impact that we're aiming to have. Are we not just creating an opportunity, but are we moving the needle when it comes to racial equity? So that was a warm-up activity. Thank you to everyone for jumping in. I see more coming in, so appreciate those. We'll take a peek at those as I'm moving along. I want to share that leading with a vision is important because it helps us to be proactive and strategic. Oftentimes we're thinking about equity from a perspective of being reactive, things that we don't want to see, and that can be draining. It can take a whole bunch of time and attention. We also have to be proactive. We have to think about what it is that we're moving towards and keep our eyes on the prize. And it's not just sort of a philosophical or aspirational eyes on the prize, but we need to be able to be specific, quantifiable. Are we moving the needle towards racial justice? Now, I know that many of you work on multiple areas of marginalization. So we know that it's not just racism that still exists, but we know we've got sexism, ableism, heterosexism, lots of isms. And at Race Forward, we think it's really important to be able to be specific about the areas of marginalization that we're working on. We lead with race, and I'm going to come back to what it means to lead with race in just a minute. I want to say that if we're not able to name a problem, we're not going to be able to address it. Racial inequities are something that exist across all indicators for success. If we want to successfully move the needle, we've got to be able to have that racial equity analysis that allows us to do so. Now, using a racial equity analysis, oftentimes we're thinking about racial equity from a race and perspective. So we're not only talking about race, but we're using intersectionality, looking at data to help us understand how does race and gender come together? How does race and sexual orientation come together? that when we use an intersectional framework, we're able to center the experiences of people who are most disproportionately impacted by systemic racism. It's not a competitive approach, it's really complementary. So looking at racism and gender together, it's going to allow us to develop the strategies we need. And it's also not just from an intersectional perspective around identity, but thinking about any of the topic areas that we work on. If we're working on reproductive justice or environmental justice, housing, any number of the areas that we might be working on, when we add race to it, again, we can get to the specificity of strategy that's going to allow us to have the greatest impact. Now, I also want to be clear that there's a lot of words that get thrown around. And I know even in our title, sometimes we hear people talk about, I'm a DEI specialist or I'm the chief equity officer. Want to take a minute to make some distinctions between these. So diversity is about representation. Who's in the room? Now, diversity and inclusion are not the same thing. We can have folks in the room, but if they're not participating, if they're not included, if they don't belong, we're not going to have impact. We can have people included from a perspective that we've got sameness. Everyone is included equally. They're the same. Or we can also think about it from an equity perspective. So each one of these four concepts is really critical, but they're not interchangeable. They're not the same thing. So for us to think about diversity, inclusion, equality, and equity, and be specific about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And the strategies to address diversity are not the same thing to address equity. I was working with now with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, was working with a mayor from a city that was and is a primarily Black city, the demographics. And this mayor, who is African American, was sharing how much progress they had made and was really quite proud of the fact that they had made some progress from a representation perspective. And it was true across sort of hierarchy and across functions. And while I always like to recognize progress, it's important for us to also recognize that just having representation doesn't mean that we're having the impact at the community level that we're trying to have. So if our goal is to change outcomes at the community level, diversity in organizations isn't going to be sufficient. Now, when I said before that equity is not a zero-sum game, when I'm doing a more in-depth conversation around narrative, one of the things that I'll take some time to break down is narratives around scarcity. Oftentimes, we do approach problems from a perspective of a zero-sum game. That if we work to increase access and opportunities and benefits for one group, that it's going to mean less for someone else. We have so many examples of when equity benefits everyone. It is not a zero-sum game. And it's really important in the stories that we tell that we're able to capture those benefits. Many of you have, and in the introduction, I know that you've got Policy Link coming to do a session with you in February. And Angela Glover Blackwell, the previous CEO of Policy Link, was the one who initially started talking about the curb cut effect. And although the curb cuts were a result of the Americans with Disability Act, what we see is that curb cuts benefit everyone. That it's people pulling suitcases, it's parents with strollers, it's elders in wheelchairs. It is a whole bunch of people that are benefiting from curb cuts. So they benefit everyone. We see this dynamic not just with something, curb cuts are such a beautiful, simple example, but there's other examples where when we're talking about eliminating disproportionalities in the criminal justice system, the fact that I had a brother who was incarcerated. I'm a white woman with a family member in an unjust criminal justice system. that there's disproportionality, but the system's not working well for me either. So when we change systems, targeting those who are suffering the worst, we actually lift up outcomes for everyone. It's an important nuance for us to pay attention to. Now, the definition of racial equity that we use at Race Forward is twofold. The idea that we need to eliminate racial disparities, part one. Part two is that we're improving outcomes for everyone. Now, from an equality perspective, we could try to make sure that things were equal for everyone, and we could do that by lowering the bar. That if we're working towards young people graduating from high school, ready for college and career, we know there's disproportionalities in those numbers right now. We could get to equality by just lowering the bars so that everyone is faring equally poor. But no, that's not what we want to do. We want to lift up outcomes for everyone. So to do this, we have to be intentional and continue to change practices, policies, systems, and structures. We have to be able to prioritize measurable changes in the lives of people of color. That's a journey. It's a path that we're taking. Policy after policy, practice after practice, system after system. Just like this road has a mile marker, we need to have mile markers for our work on racial equity. Now, when we talk about racial justice, it's a destination. It's a vision and transformation of society where we've eliminated racial hierarchies and advanced collective liberation, where Black, Indigenous, and people of color in particular have the resources, power, and self-determination to fully thrive. This vision of collective liberation is something that's going to benefit all of us. Why I started by asking you what your visions were, both personally and professionally, for us to be grounded in those visions. So I want to be clear that racial equity and racial justice are a process for moving, racial equity is a process for moving towards racial justice. Tracking the progress that we're making and recognizing that as we're making progress, the systems of racial inequities can be a little bit amorphous, that as we poke in one place, it can push out someplace else. So we have to be focused on making actual impact. Now I want to pivot to talking about bias. And a few decades ago, when implicit bias became all the buzz, I know I was at the time was working for the city of Seattle as the director of the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. And as that research was coming out about bias, one of the concerns that I was having was that there was a tendency for people to be thinking about bias from a perspective of the individual. So bias is something that I want to make sure we've got some shared racial equity analysis here, and that you understand the differences between explicit and implicit bias, but also to talk for a minute about the fact that bias doesn't just live in individual people, but it's also something that we perpetuate in our institutions, in our organizations. So explicit bias is bias that's expressed directly. The person expressing it or the organization expressing it is aware of the bias and is operating at a conscious level. Years ago, when we would see signs in the window of an apartment building, whites only, that was explicit, it was direct, there was no question about it. What we know now is that as we have passed laws that have prevented, have made explicit bias illegal, what we have seen is that we've still got bias, but instead of being expressed directly, it's expressed indirectly. And oftentimes, there are people and organizations that aren't even aware of the bias. It's operating at a subconscious level. So when I was director of the Office for Civil Rights, we did fair housing testing and would send testers out to look at property that was available. And if we found, and we did find, a property manager being more likely to do criminal background checks with people with Black sounding names versus white sounding names. That's an example of implicit bias. Now, it could be explicit if they had a policy that explicitly said that, but in most cases, that was not true. You ask the property manager, why are you doing this for one candidate versus another? And they would not even be aware of the fact that they were doing it. So when we're thinking about explicit bias and implicit bias, what we're looking for are interventions to interrupt bias. That our understanding of the different types of bias is important so that we're doing the right type of intervention. These 4 quadrants illustrate the fact that we've got it playing out at the explicit, implicit, individual, and institutional levels. So I want to take this quadrant and give you a few examples in each of these categories. So an example of institutional explicit bias, these are policies that explicitly discriminate against a group. And I'm going to use an example from policing. And it's not because policing is one of the areas where there's a bunch of headlines and it's a life or death matter. I'm using these examples because it's based on some work that we did with individual police departments. So one of the ways that Race Forward works is that we're always trying to work with organizations for you to do a diagnosis about your own organization. So these examples from policing, what police officers came up with, and many of these are going to be historical examples because, like I said, we, through the Civil Rights Act, lots of the Fair Housing Act, we've made institutional and explicit bias illegal. So we don't see those signs in the window anymore. If we do, what we need to do is file a civil rights lawsuit. We need to file a discrimination charge because it is no longer legal for a police department to refuse to hire people of color. So that's an example of institutional and explicit. An example of institutional and implicit, what we're looking for here are policies, practices, and procedures that negatively impact one group, and sometimes it's unintentional. And so what in the work with police officers, an example that they came up with was police departments focusing on street level drug arrests. Now, we know through the data that people across racial groups use drugs, depending on the drugs, at roughly equal levels, although overall data, white people use drugs more than people of color do. What we see from a criminal justice system, however, is that we've got the vast over-incarceration of people of color. So every single step of the way, from the process of who gets stopped on the street, who gets arrested, who gets charged, who gets convicted, who goes to jail, and how long they go to jail, every single step of that process, we see more and more disproportionality. And so what the police officers we were working with named was that rolling back to the very, very beginning of that system, that they were spending a whole bunch of time and resources focusing on street level drug arrests. And what they knew anecdotally was that different racial groups deal drugs in different ways. So they said, we can go to parties, we can go to college dorms. There's lots of places where drugs are being dealt, not on the street, where we've got a different demographic group, where we've got more likely to have white people who are dealing drugs. But because we are focusing on street level drug arrests, we're a part of the problem in feeding into the over-incarceration of people of color. Now, most of the work that we're doing, there's not simple solutions, right? Them just naming that as an opportunity for them to intervene in doesn't make it easy to do. Because then, in fact, I have a really clear recollection of a police officer raising his hand in kind of an animated way, saying, "You're telling us not to do our job." had to pause and try to de-escalate the conversation and say, no, that's not what we're talking about here. That when 911 calls come in around street level drug arrests, police departments need to be able to do something. The question is what you're doing the right thing? Are there other interventions that would actually lead to longer term solutions and be more equitable at the same time? So that's an example of institutional and implicit bias. An example of individual explicit bias, where we've got prejudice in action or discrimination, a police officer calling someone a racial slur while arresting them. These are the sorts of headlines that we see frequently. Very, very disconcerting. These examples need to be dealt with. No question about it. The question is the right intervention for the right type of bias. So individual officer accountability is going to be helpful, but what we can't do is think about it from a perspective of, oh, there's one bad apple. If we just get rid of that one police officer, there's going to be a change. Because what we see time and time again is that it is systems that are driving inequities. Just getting rid of one bad police officer may be helpful, but it's not going to change the system. And so when we're thinking about individual explicit bias, we want to really try to elevate it to think about what are the institutional interventions that are going to prevent that individual bias from playing out. So individual and implicit bias, this is where we've got unconscious attitudes and beliefs. So staying again with the policing example, if we had a police officer who was more likely to call for backup when stopping a person of color, that would be an example of the individual and implicit bias. If you ask that officer, are you doing that? Are you behaving differently with people of color? The officer most likely would say something like, no, I'm just following policy. I just do follow policy and do what I'm told to do. But then when you look at the data, what you actually find is that the numbers are different. So us being data-driven and really focusing on those places where an intervention is going to be able to change policy and practice is going to be a much stronger leverage point than just thinking about individuals. So want to ask you all to take a minute to think about your own organization. What we have found that working on organizational change efforts is that oftentimes organizations are really focusing on both explicit and individual. And this can be from the reactive or from a proactive perspective. So we'll think about things like, we'll have to respond to a complaint, or we'll think about diversity efforts from a pipeline perspective or upward mobility. Those are ways that we can think about individual interventions. But where I want to ask you to think about is what are the ways in which institutional implicit bias is playing out? Where are there policies that your organization has that might negatively impact one group unintentionally? So I have a little poll. So Tracy, if you could put the poll up, have some examples of those sorts of places where we see institutional implicit bias playing out. And if you could check any of the boxes where you, see bias playing out in your own organization.
For some reason, it's not working when I'm trying to click on it, the poll. Maybe it's just me.
Is that you, Donna?
Yes, I was just trying to click on the poll and it's not doing anything. So I don't know.
I think it might be because you're a co-host.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
yes, that's exactly.
Right then. No worries. I'm free of not having to do the poll. Okay, thanks.
This is, we've got 72 people who have participated so far. Keep the votes coming in. I don't want to put time pressure on because I really want you to think about sort of the places where you see institutional implicit bias playing out. And Tracy, when we close the poll, are we going to be able to see the results?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, perfect.
Just let me know when you want to close.
Yeah, I think we should close it. Comment in the chat that one of the areas not listed is the pay gap. I would love to hear a little bit more about that. I was kind of thinking that was within personnel policies, but we can jump into that in a little bit more detail. So the numbers that y'all identified, we've got nearly 60%, 59% of you identifying institutional implicit bias in your personnel operations. 34%, about a third of you, contracting and purchasing. 9%, the products that you sell. 39%, the services that you provide. And over 2/3, 67% organizational culture. So organizational culture was the most highly rated group. And then 9% of you had other categories, and 9% of you said that you don't see institutional racism in your organization. So this is really helpful to be able to identify what it is that you all are grappling with. And I'm curious whether any of you would be willing to come off mic and to give the two that I would like to sort of hone in on are around personnel and organizational culture, and would ask whether there's anyone who's willing to share an example. And I see that Mercedes raised their hand. So can we give Mercedes the mic?
Yes, go ahead, Mercedes.
Hello. So the personnel, I think you had stated it earlier that diversity in the group doesn't necessarily equate to inclusion. And so we've done a lot of work to increase the diversity of our organization. However, for those members, it doesn't feel like we're at a place that we're ready to have them. And it's like that, how to do it with skill, how to do it supportively, and give them a voice within our conversations.
Right.
So why we've intentionally expanded, we have so much more intentional work to do.
Yeah. I love the way that you named that, both from a perspective of personnel and organizational culture, that when it comes to personnel policies, that sometimes one of the dynamics that we see is that if we're focusing on diversity, trying to recruit people into the organization, but the culture isn't changing, then what happens is that we create a revolving door. So we pull people in, but then they're disrespected, their voices are marginalized, they're tokenized, all those sorts of things that can and do happen, and then they leave. And so this revolving door phenomenon is something that, as we're working to diversify and to create different personnel policies, we also have to work on organizational culture. So I see Sydney is making a comment. Sydney, would you like to come off mic and share that? Or I can just read the comment. Are you off mic now?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have a button.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Just that the upstream the upstream impacts of the pool of applicants being biased also impacts the personnel choices you make when you have a specialized role, that the choices we make early on as to who gets those early opportunities for training or for just like work experience then impact the pool of applicants over a long period of time. And so it's important to take those things into consideration as well.
Yeah, very, very much so. Thank you for sharing that. You gave me a bit of a flashback in using the word pipeline. I was working with an organization, and the superintendent of the organization was talking to a group of employees, and the group of employees was advocating for the fact that there was not diversity, there was not representation within some job classifications. And the superintendent actually made a remark around the fact that there's just not good candidate pools. And it was such a fascinating dynamic because someone that that had been working there for many years actually stood up and said, you know, when you first said that 30 years ago, I believed you. And if 30 years ago we had been working to change our systems, we would have the candidate pools that we need right now, combined with the fact that we're not including the appropriate minimum qualifications to get the right pools. We're not doing the recruitment the right way. It's too easy for leadership to use excuses around not having a diverse candidate pool. So, Sydney, thank you for naming that. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done within that sort of body of work. Well, let's see. Wendy raised her hand. Wendy, you want to take the mic?
Okay, yeah. So my thing is that I feel like sometimes that the community around us is unsure of where our center stands, but that's just my personal opinion, you know, because sometimes they just don't come in, they assume, and that's where the problem lies, is not inside our institution but outside. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think what I hear you saying is that there's not trust between your organization and people that you might be wanting to recruit to your organization.
Absolutely.
And okay, yeah. And so I think part of the challenge there, that's both a culture and a policy thing. That if you've got sort of, if your organization has not historically had good relationship with communities of color, and then all of a sudden is saying like, you know, come work for us, but the organization, and Wendy, I'm not saying this specifically like your organization, this is a dynamic that cuts across multiple organizations, but trust isn't going to be immediate, that we have to build relationships so that people can see that it's not just like, oh, you know, sort of it's a whole wave of organizations issuing statements after the murder of George Floyd, where everyone wanted to issue a statement around how much they cared about racial equity. Whether that caring, whether those statements actually translate into changes in policies and practices, if the culture isn't changing, then all the statements in the world aren't going to help to create trust. So, and we're going to come back at the end to talk a little bit about sustainability, and it only is through sustainable long-term actions that we'll be able to shift dynamics and build greater trust. Okay, so thank you so much. I really appreciate you all jumping in with engagement. That it's a challenge sometimes on Zooms, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you were willing to jump in. So I want to keep us moving, have some more definitions that I want to share with you. And then, and I see one more hand up. Chris, you want to make a comment and then I'll move us on? Or we could come back to you in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving. And just to say, when it comes to bias, across all types of bias, us trying to deny bias, say that like bias doesn't exist, and what the data shows is that that can actually increase prejudice rather than eradicate it. we need to be able to name bias, openly acknowledge it, because that allows us to intervene. Now, identifying bias is a skill. And so I have yet to come across an organization that does not have bias of one sort or another. And so if you, and it feels like it's one of those sorts of skills that riding a bike, you know, once you learn to do it, oftentimes the more you do it, the better it's going to be, the more that you'll see. So looking for bias, identifying bias, is a skill. Work on it, develop it, and not only identify and develop the ability to see it, but to intervene. So the examples, you know, when I talked about doing the fair housing testing, the point was not just to collect information, but the point was to develop an intervention. So after identifying that there were property managers that were treating people of color and white people differently, what we did was an intervention where we worked with the Property Owners Association in Seattle to do some training and to develop a checklist. And that checklist can make it sound kind of superficial, but what I want to say about a checklist is that it operationalizes the way that people are being treated. So someone comes through the door and says that they're looking for an apartment to rent. It's not up to the individual property manager. Do I do a criminal background check or not? Do I show them all 4 units that are available, or do I only show them 1? Those individual decisions that are made day in, day out, having an operational checklist around this is what we do is an intervention. So all of the examples that we can come up with around implicit bias, whether we're talking about people at customer service, folks answering the phone, whether we're talking about teachers in the classroom, whether we're talking about physicians prescribing pain medication, all of those are areas where research has documented implicit bias. Our goal is developing the interventions to change the practices that are playing out. Okay, so I want to shift now to talking about racism. And if talking about race is a loaded word, talking about racism can be even more loaded. The word itself, there's some research that shows that talking about racism is one of the most on the list of activities that people try to avoid, is right near the top of the list. So like I said in the beginning, if we can't talk about something, we're never going to be able to develop the intervention. So talking about and understanding racism is critical for us to develop those interventions. Now, all racism is not the same type. And so again, I want to take a minute to give you some definitions. At Race Forward, we talk about 4 different levels of racism, some of them around individuals and some around systems. At the individual level, we've all internalized messages about race. That's within us. We also know that interpersonal racism exists. And then when it comes to systems, we've got institutional and structural. So the examples or the levels, the definitions that I will give you, the internalized racism, is the private thoughts and biases that reside within our own minds and bodies. We've all been socialized with racial constructs, and to recognize that we didn't ask for that. We didn't ask for those, and yet they live within us. And for white people, sometimes we can have been internalized around white superiority. For people of color, sometimes there's been messages around racial inferiority. Those messages live within us. They're not the same for all of us. We all have individual work that we need to do. We, however, can get stuck in doing the internalized work that actually, as we're doing work on our own internal selves, we also need to be working on the additional levels. So interpersonal racism between individuals. This is where oftentimes bias or bigotry lives. Discriminatory actions, whether you're treating someone differently based on their race in terms of housing, employment, public accommodations. That level of interpersonal racism can be discriminatory. And so again, there's legal protections about that. Moving up to systemic racism, institutional racism means that we've got unjust policies, practices, and procedures that bottom line work better for white people than for people of color, and it doesn't matter whether they're intentional or not. You look at a policy or practice, who it's working for and who it's not, and what we know is that it's institutional policies and practices that are a part of a system that are creating racial inequities. Now, structural racism means that we've got institutional racism, not just inside one institution. I talked a lot about government. We know that government has played a primary role in the creation of racial inequities, that government has done that through policy and practice, everything from redlining to the housing foreclosure crisis. We've got we've got history and culture that also reinforce that. So across institutions, across sectors, history and culture, that is what creates structural racism and racial inequities across every single indicator for success. So we can take any one area, whether we're talking about jobs or education or criminal justice, and we can look at the fact that there's primary sectors, primary institutions that are having an impact. Education is a great example where we know that school districts play a very, very large role in the racial inequities that exist, but school districts can't do it on their own. What are the other sectors and institutions that contribute to the racial inequities in the educational system? So the school district is an institution. Larger structures across the board are what come together to create the racial inequities at the community level. So us understanding these 4 levels of racism are important because not all interventions are the same. That we need strategies to address racism. And when we're talking about internalized racism, some of those interventions are things like support groups, mentoring, counseling, education, focusing on helping individual people. From an interpersonal perspective, we look at things like diversity trainings, cross-cultural dialogues, dinners where race is on the table to deal with interpersonal racism, growth, expansion, better understanding. Institutional racism is where we can change policies and practices. We can create new institutions. We can transform old institutions. Now, I love talking about the differences between transactional and transformational change. We're not going to have enough time to do that today, but want to name like the example here around creating new institutions. And I also said transforming existing institutions. Our institutions are designed to do what they do. For us to get to different outcomes, we're going to have to change those institutions, change those organizations. Now, finally, structural racism. Strategies to address structural racism, we've got to be grounded in understanding of our history. Racial inequities did not just somehow randomly appear. We have racial inequities because they were intentionally created over the vast majority of our country's history. For us to change our future, we have to understand our past. Understanding our past means that we reveal what the root causes are. We look at challenging racist myths, ideologies, the narratives that I mentioned previously. That's got to be a part of cultural change. And then we've got to be able to work across institutions with an intersectional lens. Understanding the different strategies to address racism is going to increase our likelihood to be successful. We need to ask a different set of questions. Now, when I talked about the fact that there's a lot of aversion to talking about race, sometimes that aversion is based on the reality that conversations about race can sometimes go poorly. I love asking the question in in-person settings around how many have you ever had a conversation about race that's gone poorly? And inevitably, the vast majority of people raise their hands. So if there's something that's gone poorly, there's a reason why we oftentimes will try to avoid it in the future. We can't, like I said, we can't avoid conversations. We have to be able to have those conversations, and we need to ask a different set of questions. So some of the questions that have historically been asked, we can still ask them in some situations, but we need to shift from blame to causes. So instead of asking who's a racist, the individual person who's a racist, let's also ask what's causing the racial inequities. Instead of just looking at intentions, what did that person mean? Why did they have that attitude? What was their attitude? We need to look at effects. So what were the actions and what were the impacts? Looking at intentions doesn't change anything. Have to look at the impacts. Instead of looking at prejudice, what are the beliefs that made someone do something? We need to look at the systems. What are the institutions and the organizations that are responsible, and how can we drive towards systemic change? Instead of just looking at grievances, how can we fix what just happened? We need to be solution focused. What are the proactive strategies and solutions that are going to change systems and structures? Now, this expanded set of questions is really important because in general, there's so many of us that have thought about having conversations from the left side of the screen perspective. And so we need to expand the circle. We need to expand the conversations that we're having. So actually, we did this question earlier, and I wanted to pose that. I intentionally shifted it earlier without shifting my PowerPoint. Apologies for that. But the recognition of institutional racism or bias in your own organization is where you need to be able to focus. That for us to have sustainable organizations, have to develop the muscle, the skills, the tools to address institutional racism within your own organization. Now, to do that, want to offer a tool that that we at Race Forward use a lot. It's called choice points. Now, choice points are ways that we can intervene in decision-making processes to get to different decisions. So instead of just looking at the same old, like I said, institutions are designed to do what they do. We keep making the same decisions because that's what we were brought on board to do. So instead of looking at those same old choices and actions that are going to get you the same outcomes of inequity, exclusion, and racism, we've got to look at different choices, choosing equitable options and actions, and those are going to help to produce new outcomes where equity, inclusion, and the prevention of racism take place. So all choice points are decision-making opportunities. Now, depending on where you're situated, what your job is, people have different access to choices, but every single one of us on a day in, day out basis are presented with opportunities to make decisions. The question is whether we're integrating racial equity into those decision-making points. And so love working with organizations on big choices. Like if you're doing a strategic plan or a business plan, or changing a product line or increasing services, like there's a lot of big decisions that organizations make. And sometimes like the opportunity to intervene in big decisions, like we want to get into those and very, very much encourage you to do so, but also would encourage you to build some muscle on some smaller choices. That the muscle that we build will actually be generative to allow us to take on bigger questions, and the cumulative impacts of lots of small choices can be as significant as the impacts of bigger decisions. So after the presentation, yes, I will share the PowerPoint with you, and we'll also share a choice points tool, a racial equity impact analysis, which is a set of questions that you can ask in making a decision. Using a choice point analysis can be used everything from individual consumer decisions, volunteer work, your charitable contributions, socializing, voting. Like, these are the things that we oftentimes think about from an individual perspective, but you all are here today, of course, as representatives of your organizations. And so opportunities to use a choice point analysis, some of the examples that we see are around planning, budgeting, personnel, policy development, practices. Using choice points in any of these areas are going to allow you to change the policy and change the practice, and also help to build the culture for sustainability. I'm going to give you a homework assignment. I don't know if you usually have homework assignments in these Breakfast of Champions events, but really, I feel like I'm successful in talking with you if after today's session, you actually take what I've shared and put it into operation. So after today's session, I want you to be able to identify a choice point, something that you individually, you personally have the ability to influence, a decision that may affect racial outcomes. So identify that choice point, generate some options. How do you do, what decision would you typically make? And for that choice point, think through some alternate actions that could lead to different and more equitable outcomes. Then select that new course of action. Decide which of the options is going to leverage the most equitable change. For us to develop the muscle to create change, we've got to be able to test things out and then analyze the impact. Did you have the impact that you thought you were going to have? And if you didn't, what else could you do? I would also encourage you to think about this from not just from an individual perspective, but for you to think about your colleagues, think about others, maybe other people in this session. You've got to create a culture and allies and co-conspirators who are going to help you to make decisions that further racial equity. Transforming into a race-conscious and equity-centric organization is a matter of identity. That most of you are probably from organizations that have identities that are grounded in a mission that is about your line of business, about your line of work. We need to be able to integrate a racial consciousness and focus equity so that we've got those policies and practices, and you shift the very identity. That as you've got more and more decision makers and stakeholders using racial equity tools for key decisions, you're going to be able to grow an equity-centric organizational practice and culture. Now, this is something not to be done just by individual free agents. I know many of you have teams, whether they're diversity, equity, and inclusion teams, whether they're broader than that, whether they're more focused than that. Would encourage you to think about those teams from an organizing perspective. So who's got the power, who's got the influence, who's got the ability to lead for change, and who's going to be the team that helps to make that happen. So anytime that we're talking about creating change, have to not only be talking about normalizing, have focused today on a shared set of definitions. Those definitions are really critical. That if we're just looking at individuals, that sometimes what we'll end up doing is we'll end up treating people and communities of color as if they are a problem to be fixed, as opposed to the system. So that understanding of institutional racism and having a shared analysis is really necessary for you to bring about change. Again, just having a shared understanding, not enough. We need to also be doing the organizing. So building internal infrastructure, that DEI team or the racial equity core team, critical to internal change. And also, you need to be doing organizing across sectors. So never going to have individual organizations that are able to accomplish everything on their own. When you're trying to move the needle and to be a positive contributor to advancing racial equity, what are the partnerships that are needed? The Collective Impact Forum came up years ago, probably 15 years ago, the work on collective impact, really looking at how we can collectively have impact on changing conditions in community. Really interesting work that was done decades ago. And just recently, they have come up with some new tools around how to integrate racial equity into collective impact. I say that within the context of organizing because partnerships are so critical. Having a well-aligned sectoral change effort where you're all aligned around the same vision, but different organizations have different roles, you're always working with community, the communities that are most negatively impacted at the very center of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. That's all about organizing. Third, operationalizing. I talked about the choice point tool today. There's other racial equity tools. Incorporated in tools are often the use of data. Now, data I want to give a little bit of a caveat to, because oftentimes, and I'm a policy wonk by background. I love good policy. Good policy is always informed by data. But one of the lessons that I learned early on is that data doesn't actually help to change minds. That if people are presented with data that they disagree with, they actually discount the data. The other thing about data is that data can sometimes be used to perpetuate stereotypes. Data can be used to trigger implicit bias. Of course, we don't intentionally want to do that, but I offer those as caveats because of the fact that we have to be smart about the way that we use data. We need to use data to develop strategies and drive results, measure whether we're having the impact that we wanted to have. Now, this is an iterative process. So it's not like we just normalize and then we organize and then we operationalize. These three things are centered around that vision that I started with, and that as we're doing more normalizing, we do more organizing, we do more operationalizing, and we keep going deeper with each of these three areas to move us towards our vision. This is what's going to build resilience in our organizations. And by resilience, what I mean is the long-term commitment. That our commitment to racial equity, for us, each of our organizations to be doing our part, the racial inequities that we see in our communities were put into place, were built over century after century. We will need to have resiliency in our organizations to actually change those conditions in the community. So building each of these muscles within your organization can help to create resiliency. Now that's about your organization. Also want to talk about resiliency across organizations. And so across our organizations, in order to get to a just multiracial democratic society, there's four things that we can be doing across organizations in order to build resiliency. So we have to be building power. And that means building power to create change, to achieve our vision. Connecting and aligning networks of people, organizations, and movements to advance racial justice. I love the fact that that you all exist, Partners for Diversity, doing such wonderful work across organizations. Given your shared commitments, How are you growing power to advance racial justice? Transforming policy. Number two, too frequently when policy is talked about, it's either within an organization or there's kind of that big P policy that we think about, governmental policy. Both are important and both need to transform. The reality of many times within institutions, people thinking they have the solutions without positioning people and communities of color as leaders and decision makers in the policy making process. And so if you're changing policy within your own organization from a transformational perspective, who's at the table? Who's analyzing the conditions? Who's coming up with the solutions? To effectively transform policy, we need to be centering people and communities of color as the people with the expertise, the knowledge, the solutions. Third, transforming institutions and sectors. This work around transformation of institutions and sectors, for us at Race Forward, we talk a lot about government. One of our core projects, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, is a national network of local government working to transform government. And we love working with government because of the very nature of the public sector. A public sector for the public good is different than what we have today. We know the history of government, and we also know what's possible. We've got to be able to transform the public sector. That's what the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is doing. And I have seen that there's quite a few of you here today who may already be GARE members. So I want to pause for a second and say thank you for the work that you're doing to change the public sector. Last thing, transforming culture. The narratives that get told around race and racism right now in our country, thinking about the polarization that exists, the context of that polarization, changing demographics, where we've got a lot of demographics that are being shifted, and there's a lot of fears that are being stoked from a perspective of maintaining the status quo. That if there are people who are afraid of the possibilities of a multiracial democratic society, then they're just going to be fighting to maintain the status quo. We have to be able to tell a different story, a story of what our country is now and what it can be in the future. That aspiration of what we can become is a story that can actually be really mobilizing and helpful, not only within organizations, but across organizations, and the very nature of who and what we are. This building resiliency is important that we think about it beyond, the slide that I said, this is about building resiliency in our organizations. Sometimes we're going to have barriers within our own organizations. We're going to have ups and downs. Work's going to ebb and flow. As opportunities arise and other ones dissipate, there's going to be challenges. And so the reality that we need resiliency, not just in our own organization, but across our organizations. This is the work that helps to build resiliency of us collectively. I'm sorry. I think I wanted to close out, and I know I'm coming up on the time, and I also wanted to make sure that we've got a few minutes for questions that y'all might have. Before we shift to questions, just wanted to add in a little advertisement for Race Forward. We are your partners in this work because Race Forward is catalyzing movement building for racial justice. And when we talk about movement building, we're talking about a broad idea of movement. Yes, we need grassroots, community-based organizations. That's the history of change in the United States. Change has taken place because of community organizing, putting pressure on government or putting pressure on the private sector. We need to continue to support that level of movement, but we're also at a moment in time where we have people within organizations, such as all of yourselves, who are working within organizations to advance racial justice. That's movement too. So at Race Forward, we recognize a broad idea of movement building. We work in partnership with communities, organizations, and sectors to build strategies to advance racial justice in our policies, our institutions, and cultures. I've mentioned some of these core projects that we have: Color Lines, our online journalism, Government Alliance on Race and Equity. We've got a biennial Facing Race conference in November of this year. It will be hybrid, a portion of it in Phoenix, Arizona, a portion of it online, to make sure that regardless of the COVID situation, everyone will be able to participate. And then we also, last but not least, have an initiative that's called Mass Freedom, that is around ending the carceral system, really looking at a liberatory practice that would be about our mass freedom. So with that, I want to actually ask if you all have any questions, and to close out with any questions or discussions or comments that you would like to share.
Thank you so much, Julie. As people are putting their questions into Q&A box, I did get a couple sent directly to me. And so I'm just going to go ahead and ask that as people drop it in the Q&A box. So you had mentioned that there are barriers within the institution. What if some of those barriers were the leaders themselves or the board members? How do you recommend people go about making that culture change?
Yeah. You know, that's a great question, because I know there's so many organizations where that is the reality. And so when I talk about organizing, where you need to start is a stakeholder analysis. And so depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish, like if you're starting from scratch and you don't have a shared analysis, you don't have a vision, you don't have leadership commitment, sometimes the organizing that needs to take place is you building your base of core allies within the organization. So you don't have to start big and broad, like go on to leadership to ask for something if in fact you haven't done the groundwork. So really from an organizing perspective, thinking about who your allies are across the organization, not just within your own sort of sphere of control, but where are the connections that you can start to build a stronger number of people who are committed. We use an organizational change theory that's called the tipping point practice. The work of Andrea Shapiro, her book called Creating Contagious Commitment, has a set of levers that you can analyze, and depending on whether you've got leadership support, sometimes you've got leadership support, but you've got other gaps that are missing, really doing an analysis to understand what the gaps are, and then coming up with the right organizing interventions. It's not always like start, you know, come one, come all, but thinking about your key stakeholders and where you can build support.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And next question, you had talked about, you know, data can be tricky, right? Some people are going to push back. So in Oregon recently, we passed legislation that would require school districts to teach ethnic studies. And we've learned that there have been some administrators and teachers and even board members who have received death threats for pushing forward, an equity curriculum. And so, you know, if you can talk a little bit about, people who are pushing back and resistant to this type of work.
Yeah. No, the attacks on critical race, what's being called critical race theory, and let me be clear, it's not critical race theory, but nevertheless, sort of opposition is using that as their organizing framework for attacking the work that we're doing to advance racial justice. So a couple of thoughts that I have without actually having looked at the legislation itself, some of the legislation follow-up work that needs to be done. I think that there's huge narrative challenge as well. And so this idea of like, this is something that's being forced on people, that it is like, it's about like sort of, a lot of the CRT legislation actually uses language around like, this is making white children uncomfortable, which like some of this stuff is just makes my brain explode a little bit. But after putting my brain back together, like really what we need to be doing is a pivot. So thinking about us being able to talk about our history to get to an equitable future. That talking about ethnic studies is not something that we're doing for people in communities of color. This is about our collective understanding of where we are, where we've been, and where we want to be, leaning into a vision of what is possible with a multiracial democracy. And so much of the, you know, sort of the scarcity frame that I talked about, where it's like we're doing ethnic studies, like we're hurting white kids. No, we're helping white kids. This is to our collective benefit, and would point you in the direction of an organization called Showing Up for Racial, two organizations, Race Forward. We've got some tools that are around honest education, action, and leadership. I'm happy to give them to you, Tracy, and you could distribute them to folks. And then the other one is a group called Showing Up for Racial Justice. It's a group doing organizing within white, suburban, and rural communities, and really looking at the necessity of addressing white communities, that it's white people who have created the problem, and we need to be able to organize and operationalize in accountable relationship with people of color, but it's us who need to be working with our families, our colleagues, our friends and neighbors. And so to really encourage you to think about both using tools and supporting the work of white people who need to be working with white people.
Wonderful. I think that's a great point to end on and wrap up. Thank you so much, Julie, for providing us with the practical tools. I particularly am appreciative of the examples of the different questions and the concept of choice points. So I look forward to learning a little bit more about that. Special thanks to Greenbrier Companies for sponsoring this session and for their continued support of diversity, equity, and inclusion. For those in the audience, I hope you take what you learned today and put it into practice. Remember, this work is a marathon, not a sprint, and the path will be different for everyone. A recording of the session and the PowerPoint will be sent to you in the next day or so. And also, as a note, if you missed any of our past Breakfast for Champions or Equity Conversations, our new website has some of our most popular virtual sessions in the members only section. So feel free to go there and review some of the past sessions. And before you leave, please take a few minutes to send us your feedback. It will help us better serve you. The survey is being posted in the chat box right now. We hope to see you at our next program, which is next Thursday. Links to all of those February programs are also being posted in the chat box. So thank you so much for being here and spending your morning with us. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Donna at Greenbrier. Have a wonderful morning. Take care.